Thanks for joining me for this presentation in the Adobe FrameMaker Essentials series, Translation Management with XLIFF. My target audience for this presentation is organizations looking to localize content for different geographical regions. All right, hold up. What was wrong with that last statement? Let's take a look at it again. And what's wrong? Well, for starters, abbreviations and jargon tend to distract from the messaging, both in core language and in other regions and languages, even within the same language in various regions. And let's be honest, for those using UK flavors of English, you probably bristled just a bit when you saw localization with a Z rather than localization with an S. And don't even get me started on Z versus Z. So basically, if I hadn't come back to clean some of this stuff up, I might have initially lost the trust and interest of you before we even get started on the topic. And that's one of the main reasons that getting your translation and localization done properly is so important. But translation and localization is still something that's only partly understood by many. You may have noticed that to this point, I haven't used any images in the presentation, and that's because as I searched stock photography sites using my presentation title, I had trouble finding images that matched up. Here's one of the better results that I got when I searched Adobe stock using the title of this presentation. At least we could interpret this image as someone who's having trouble translating the content in a storefront. When I broadened the search out just a little bit, here's a representative sample of images that showed up. I'm guessing that it saw XLIFF as something close to XLIFF, and I can't even explain the rest of it. So if we're having such a tough time finding images that relate to localization, translation, and XLIFF in general, this is a good time to go over some vocabulary. Translation and localization, that process of adjusting text in your document to better fit a different language or a different region within the same language, can occur in a wide variety of ways. At one end, you've got a person with a machine that has knowledge of the changes that need to be made, and they physically rewrite the text. On the other end of the spectrum is machine translation, or MT, which is the automatic conversion of text or speech from one language to another using algorithms without any human intervention. Machine translation, MT, uses systems that analyze and map the structures of the source language to other languages based on specific rules, patterns, or neural networks. MT systems are in a lot of the online platforms that you already use. Things like Google Translate and Microsoft Translator might be running in the background to translate a web page, a forum post, or speech to text. Machine translation relies upon translation memory, or TM. A TM is a database used by translation tools to store segments of translated text along with the original text. Those segments might be sentences, phrases, or paragraphs. But the smaller the size of the segment, the more easily it can be reused as you go forward, assisting machine translation or human translators by automatically recalling previously translated segments when it encounters the same or similar content in new documents. This means as you continue to work on your translation memory, you're adding more and more segments, allowing you to create a larger leverage of existing translations in your future projects. The TM can also identify fuzzy matches, where it may not be an exact match, but it can suggest something similar and allow a human operator to identify and correct that match, thus improving the translation memory going forward. Generally, this is going to happen in real time, making the translator's work much easier and much more efficient. An accurate translation memory is critical for accurate machine translation, but TM's also used with computer-assisted translation, or CAT, where a human operator will work with a software tool and a translation memory to rapidly process files. With a computer-assisted translation, or CAT tool, an operator will identify the things not yet part of the translation memory and analyze that content that's not been automatically translated to create new segmentation, and then translate those individual segments. Over time, this leads to better terminology management, allowing the consistent use of terms by translators to create and manage glossaries of specific terms. These tools also generally have concordance search capabilities, allowing the translators to search the translation memory for similar phrases or words to maintain the translation consistency. And because of the nature of the work, CAT tools have very high-level spell check, grammar check, and verification of term consistency features, as these are all necessary to maintain high-quality translations. While we often think of computer-assisted translation as something that's a vendor task, something that you will outsource, that's not necessarily the case. There are plenty of tools available that you can license either for installation on your desktop or as software as a service through the cloud that will allow people within your organization to create a translation memory using terminology management, segmentation, and alignment to do all of this work in-house. So we've spent a couple of minutes talking about the need for translation and localization, and we've covered some of the vocabulary that we're going to use. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about you, me, and what kind of money you can expect to spend or save with effective translation and localization. Why is translation so important to you and your company? Well, you may be looking to open or expand additional markets for your content and delivering of your products. If you're already localizing, you're probably interested in improving the accuracy of the content versus having in-house translators translate and localize based on their own personal experience. And almost certainly you're interested in reducing the time and the effort that it takes to move from one language or region to another. And why is this topic important to me? The bottom line is basically the bottom line. Many of my large projects in the last 10 years or so were funded by savings in localization and translation. And who am I? I'm Matt Sullivan, and I'm a FrameMaker online course creator, author of a number of FrameMaker reference and workbooks, a trainer, and a consultant. Over the years, Adobe has assigned me a few titles, including Adobe Certified Expert, Instructor, and Professional for all the apps in the Technical Communication Suite, and about a dozen other Creative Cloud and non-Creative Cloud products like Adobe Connect. I'm also a community expert in the Adobe user-to-user forums, and you can find those at community.adobe.com. And if you click on Technical Communication and e-learning, you'll get quicker access to the topics that are listed here. Now, if you're not listening to this presentation live, you may have found it on Adobe's TCS page on YouTube. There's lots of material on that YouTube page, and you'll find links to DITA World recordings, training, including this series, how-tos, and new feature videos, including the ones that I produced for the last handful of versions. Another thing I help out with is DITA World, which is a great annual conference for folks that are using Structured FrameMaker and Adobe Experience Manager. Stefan and I have been co-hosting this event for about the last half dozen years or so. Okay, so getting back to those localization drivers I was talking about earlier, here are some numbers to attach to the business goals that I mentioned before my intro. According to organizations like Common Sense Advisory, also known as CSA Research, in 2023, the global localization services market, the language services and localization market, was valued in the $60 billion range. In 2023, the global localization services market, the language services and localization market, was valued in the $60 billion range. That's projected to be near $100 billion in 2032. And within this market, documentation localization, which includes translating technical manuals, business documents, software documentation, legal texts, and more, is about 15 to 20% of that total market, or around $9 to $12 billion globally in 2023. With annual growth currently running about 7 to 8%, the documentation market is expected to be near $15 billion annually by the late 2020s. Of course, those numbers just tell us that the market's big. It doesn't directly impact what we do on a day-to-day basis. To drive it home, let's talk a little bit about the reduction in localization costs via structure and XLIFF. Bringing it back to something that's more relatable. Reduction in localization costs via structure and XLIFF can be substantial. I had one client, a medical device company, that cut their annual localization costs from well over $100,000 to about $60,000 a year by properly implementing a structured localization workflow. Although no one can guarantee a rate of return, if you're in a properly controlled environment and using technologies like structure models and export to XLIFF, your return on investment is certainly going to be worth the effort. So here's what you'll want to know to get started. FrameMaker has built-in support for localization or translation workflows using the industry standard XLIFF format. XLIFF creates a series of files with smaller components that can be more easily translated and reused by translation software or by your translation vendor. These translated components can also be stored in something called a translation memory file or translation memory, helping you or your translation vendor maximize reuse of previous translations, and this is something that'll save you time and money. And here's what the whole thing looks like inside of FrameMaker. If you'd like to follow along, you can find the files that I'm using under the Help menu in Samples. It's going to open up a Windows Explorer window. In there you'll find my favorite set of demo files, which is this user guide, Arabic, English, and Hebrew. Inside of there, I'm going to go with the English version of this, and I'm going to copy that and put it into a writable directory. Basically, that's because these files exist inside of the Adobe FrameMaker 2022 directory, which is a locked directory. I'll have problems saving changes and using that as a working directory. I've already created that directory and put the files inside of it. So you can see basically I've got a FrameMaker project folder, and then in there I've got my base files, which are my English files. Inside of there, I'll open up the Personal Spaceship User Guide, English, US version, and I'll be working with the general description. So I've got a 14-page document, and this document is paragraph-based. Just to reinforce that, I'm going to go up to the Structure menu item, look at my structure view, see that there's nothing in the structure view when I have something selected in the document. And that information is going to help me as I go into the next dialog box. Going up to the File menu, I've got a translation option and the ability to export to XLIFF 1.2. I get a reminder to save any changes that I've made. So I'll go ahead and do that and just do it one more time. Now we get to settle in and talk about all the parts of this dialog box. At the top, we've got the package file name. This will be the output file that I run through my translation software or that I provide to my vendor. It gives me the option to name it and to store it wherever I want. For simplicity's sake, I'm only working with the document, but I very easily could have gone to the book file and run this entire process on the book itself. Once we do this for a single file, I'll go back and run the whole process again on the Personal Spaceship User Guide. This first time running through, I do have an option to identify an XTS file. If I'd previously translated this content, then that XTS file would be very helpful. It would be a documentation of all the things in this dialog box and the preferences that I needed for either my software or my vendor. My source language is already set to English, so I'm set there. And then we have two options down below here. One is to embed the skeleton to the XLIFF. Now the skeleton is that file that ultimately we'll be re-importing the XLIFF into. So this is basically a courtesy for instance, a software vendor so that they know what it is you're going to be working with. This option here to apply the XLIFF segmentation rules allows me to define a document that will further break up this file into even smaller chunks that are more easily translated and more easily reused. We'll talk about XLIFF segmentation rules after we do the translation for this single file using mostly defaults. Every FrameMaker document, both structured and unstructured, has a set of master pages, a set of reference pages, and then catalog entries for things like conditional text, text insets, and variables. In the MIF settings on the left-hand side of this dialog, we have the option to send some of those things or all of those things to our translation software or our translation vendor to get them localized into the various languages and regions that we're going to send the information. While deselecting these things makes for a smaller file and thus a less expensive or a faster localization, some of these things are likely going to be localized along with the content in your body flow. Over on the right side, we've got structured FrameMaker options for including or excluding the things associated with the EDD. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have content options to include or exclude things that might be inserted automatically and thus cause problems with the localization. For instance, a discretionary hyphen might prevent something from being identified as a previously translated item. Not only does that slightly complicate the process, but overall it prevents reuse to the extent that you might be able to reuse content and translations within your document. Once you've gone through and set these as you need, you can go ahead and save settings and then have a specific XTS for your next project. I'll go ahead and save settings. And I'll save it in my FrameMaker project folder just so I know where it's at for later. I'll go ahead and export the file. And once it's finished processing, you can see that I've got an XLIFF conversion report that shows up in its own panel. Fortunately, I don't have any errors or warnings. I've got an information count on the number of items that it found. And then a log file explaining what happened. And if I get something that stops the process, this can be useful to find out exactly what it is that is stopping up my process. So what exactly did we end up with? If I open up a Windows Explorer panel, go into my FrameMaker project folder, you'll find the general description zip file that I created. I'll select Extract All. And that lets me go into Result, XLIFF, and find my file, the general description, MIF-ML, XML localization, interchange file format. I'm going to open that up with Notepad++, which is just an easy-to-use editor with some code hinting. And you can see at the top that we've got our XML encoding right here. So we do know that we've got an XML file, even though this is kind of a mess. Now we go all the way down into here, and you can see that we have a file that has markup that can be edited just as any other text file could be. Now, while I could go area by area and take all of the black text and then convert it to the language that I want, that kind of goes against what we're trying to do. In this case, I'm just trying to show you, you can open this up, you can edit, resave, and then bring that back into FrameMaker. Now that we've seen how that works on a single file basis, let's go to the Personal Spaceship User Guide and export the entire file out to XLIFF. Now for illustration purposes, I'm going to open up a couple of these files. I'll make sure to select the FrameMaker book file, and then go to File, Translation, and Export to XLIFF one more time. My package file name now has my book file name. I've still got all the other settings from the last time. And I can go ahead and export. And here you can see the reason that I opened up the other files. If you have files open while you are processing the XLIFF file, then you're likely to see those files flip through the open document window as it processes. So that's just a normal thing that you can expect. I'll check on my output. And here's the zip file for the Personal Spaceship User Guide. I'm ready to submit that to my localization vendor and then import the whole thing back into the book. When you get the files back from your vendor, it's easy to reverse the process and view your localized files. Use the File, Translation, Import XLIFF function to reflow your content. And here's the translated file. All that's left now is to do some nominal book numbering and apply a localized German FrameMaker template to take care of the auto numbering for things like my table titles. Once you've established your XLIFF translation workflow, you're ready for the next step, which is pre-segmenting your XLIFF file. This helps you break down your content into smaller, more reusable chunks. I'll come back to pre-segmenting your XLIFF in a little bit. But first, I want to show you some ways that you can get started with localization and translation without necessarily going to a localization vendor, pre-segmenting your XLIFF file, or even creating your own translation memory. When you're just getting started with translation and localization, you might be tempted to go straight to this guy, the large language model known as ChatGPT. And that makes sense. Large language models are built to analyze text, and one of the things that they can do is to create translations. But while ChatGPT can assist with translations, it's not specifically designed for this purpose, like dedicated systems such as DeepL. We'll look more at DeepL in particular as we go further in this presentation. While ChatGPT can currently translate into about 85 languages, and it has a general understanding of languages, its translations, particularly languages with significant differences, may not always be as natural or as accurate as those from specialized translation tools. ChatGPT lacks features like glossaries, alternative suggestions, and translation management system integration, all of which enhance a professional translation workflow. While something like ChatGPT might be useful for occasional translations and translation-related advice, it's not a suitable replacement for established machine translation systems. For your professional work, commercial systems and customizable translation tools are much more effective. Oh, and in case you're wondering, that description of ChatGPT is the summary of a blog post on the Across Language Technology website that I created using ChatGPT. But starting with ChatGPT and DeepL is more like starting in the middle. So let's back up a bit. If you're just getting ready to dip your toe into the localization market, one of the first steps that you can take is to work with something like Google Translate. But many of the largest software companies in the world have their own translation model. So while Google Translate is easily available via a browser, depending on the software services that you have within your organization, you could look at Microsoft Translator for help with Microsoft tools like Word and Teams, Amazon Translate for organizations that have a heavy AWS presence, or IBM Watson Language Translator for vertical markets and specific industry needs. Of these options, Google Translate's probably the easiest one to relate to right now. Here's a simple example using Google Translate. If I navigate in my document to the Operating Limitations chapter, we can see on the first page there is a danger statement. In my example, I need to translate these danger statements for people on the flight that may not speak English. I'm going to select the text, copy it, shift over to Google Translate, paste my text, and set my languages appropriately. Notice that my danger statement didn't come through. That's because it's part of the paragraph style, so I'll go back and fix that when I paste in my translation. For now, I'll copy the translation, shift back to FrameMaker, create another paragraph, and then paste in my content. You can see now it's going to be helpful to turn off spell check to get rid of all the red squiggles. With the text inside of my document, I'll apply a paragraph style. And you can see that we're getting close. Since this will be a Spanish statement inside of an English document, I'm going to add this paragraph style to my English template. If the entire document was being translated, then I would rather use a Spanish template to replace all my labels and make the entire document appear in Spanish. So now I'll create the extra paragraph style. I'll create my new style using the Spanish word for danger, and I'll make sure that I create style to avoid overwriting or renaming the other style. We can see now that my document down here, my paragraph has peligro as the style, where this one is still danger. Moving to the numbering, make the same change here. Update style. And we're ready to go. Going one step deeper, we're going to use a paid online tool called DeepL. Now, DeepL has a free version with limited functionality, but they also have more advanced features. And in this demo, I've actually got a 30-day trial of the tool to show you some of the things that you can do. I'll start by reselecting my text to be translated. And then in a browser, I'll open up the DeepL web portal. You can see that I've already logged in to my Trial Pro account. So I've got access to both the Pro features and those available in the free version. Putting in my text. Now I can switch over and I can change to my target language, which is Spanish. Now I'll copy this text to the clipboard and then switch back over to FrameMaker. Notice the window that came up here suggesting that I download a desktop app to make things even more convenient. I'll skip that for now. And then back in FrameMaker, add another paragraph, paste in my content, set my paragraph style to peligro, and a quick scan shows us that exceden is now replaced with sobrepasan. Also, resultan is now replaced with provocan. So the translations are very close, but they are slightly different. I'm not entirely fluent in Spanish, but my guess is that the Google Translate translation was more word for word, and the DeepL translation had a little bit more context. Of course, you'd want to check with a native Spanish speaker or a professional translator to see which one is a more accurate translation in this context. But back over in DeepL, notice that we also have the option to look at either an informal or a formal tone, or to allow DeepL to choose automatically. While this short piece of text doesn't change translation when I switch between formal and informal, longer passages will certainly have more context added to or taken away from the translation. You probably already noticed that there is a Translate Files option inside of DeepL. Switching to that panel, we see that DeepL does support XLIFF-files. And as a reminder, earlier we created the general description zip file using the XLIFF dialog box. We decompressed, and when we decompressed it, we ended up with an XLIFF file. Inside of DeepL, if I select that file, unfortunately, DeepL hangs up. Now that's because DeepL supports XLIFF 2.1, and what we created from FrameMaker was XLIFF 1.2. There's no problem with that because we do have a way to tether DeepL together with an XLIFF 1.2 translator. But while we're here, note that you can take PDF, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files along with a bunch of other file formats and translate using the DeepL translator. It's not what we're doing right now, but it's sure to come in handy in your work. To translate an XLIFF 1.2 file, I'm going to integrate my DeepL account with any of a number of CAT tools. For this first example, I'm going to use a program called Doc3. Going to doc3.com, I can go to the login area, and as soon as I log in, I'm taken directly to where I can create a new project. I'll quickly step through the things that are required. Adding my file. And if I've already been working with Doc3 for a while, here's where I can attach my translation memory for pre-translation. Since I'm using a trial of Doc3 Pro, I'm able to connect a commercial MT engine at this point. So DeepL is my commercial MT engine. Clicking here takes me to the API section where I can paste these numbers in. And unfortunately, here's where I hit a snag. Right now, the connection to my machine translation service for DeepL Pro and DeepL Free have been changed. They changed their API setup, so I'm not able to put these numbers in. But I will show you that if you have a paid version of DeepL Pro, you can do this. You can go to DeepL Pro, and then from DeepL, you can navigate to your account. And on the Account tab, you'll get your authentication key right here. It's important to know that for DeepL, you need to have at least a Pro account to get an API key. So if you're using the Pro trial, right now that's broken. If you have a paid Pro or Ultimate subscription, then not only will you have access to the key, mine happens to look like this, but you'll have success when you post that key in this field. Just to show you what happens, it just tells me the API key is invalid. So we'll skip the machine translation portion of it right now. Back to the new project. I'll just click on Don't Use MT and hit Continue. Getting past one last Doc3 Pro option. Now I'm ready to start using my computer-assisted translation software. But since I wasn't able to put the machine translation in there, I'm going to switch to a different tool called MemoQ. You'll see that the trial version setup and the configuration are about the same, using each of these two popular tools. I've chosen to use MemoQ because it's got a 30-day download and it's fairly easy to configure. But a quick web search will give you plenty of tools to choose from, and generally speaking, they'll connect to the MT tools like we're doing here, no matter what you're using for machine translation. Let's take a look at how MemoQ and DeepL get tethered together. In MemoQ, I'll create a new project from template. And in my FrameMaker project folder, go to that decompressed general description file and that same XLIFF file that we looked at manually a while ago. I'll go ahead and hit Next. And then I'll click on Review Settings. And in Resources, I want to make sure that my machine translation settings are set to all. Having confirmed that, I'll go ahead and close the dialog and hit Finish. Inside my new project, I'll go to Settings and come over to MT Settings, where I can choose Create Use New. A quick identifier, and confirm the mandatory dialog. I want to make sure I've got the checkbox next to the DeepL service. And then I can click on Translations. Now I can open up this file. And at this point, I can start translating the segments of my file, taking advantage of machine translation, and building my own translation memory so that future translations are more efficient and straightforward. There's only one problem, and that's when I go to confirm this segment translation, MemoQ tells me that the project has no working primary translation memory. I'll swing over to my Resources panel here. And at the top, I've got translation memories. And I'll create new. I'll choose from the most appropriate English language. And also the most appropriate localized Spanish language for my region. I'll leave everything as the defaults for now. And close out of the dialog. Back at the project home, I'll select Adobe Demo Translation Memory. Going back to General Description. And it's been stored. Back in Settings, come over to MT. You can see that I've still got my DeepL machine translation engine active. But I don't want to do all these terms manually. And if I come to Project Home and Settings, we see that we've got DeepL set up. So next we'll look at applying the machine translation using the DeepL service that we've added. With all my threads connected, I can now start getting each of the segments translated properly. Starting with this row, I'll come up to Lookup Term, check out my options in the translation results over here, and double-click to add that suggestion to my document. History of flight, Lookup Term, double-click on the suggestion, and confirm. Flight used to depend on an aircraft, Lookup Term, double-click on suggestion, and you get the idea. While I may not get a lot of reuse out of the segments in this document within this first project, this translation memory will pay off dividends in the long run as I reuse these segments in other documents. And in a document like this, you can quickly get a sense of how much reuse you can get out of creating phrases like personal spaceship and external tank and auxiliary takeoff power, as those phrases will be used quite often in this document and other documents within this organization. Being able to recognize linguistic patterns and then setting up those linguistic patterns as XLIFF pre-segmentation rules can dramatically increase the level of reuse within your translations and that leveraging of the translation memory. But instead of looking up each term individually, we want to make use of our translation memory. So going to the Preparation tab, we can click on Pre-Translate and set up our options for our machine translation so we can quickly enter the translations for our segments. Once the processing's done, you can see that as I click on each row, I just have to go over and double-click to insert that recommendation over into my document. Going to the next item, go through, confirm the accuracy, and double-click. We'll do a couple more, and double-click, and double-click. And now this is ready for review, perhaps by somebody else on our team. Once you're satisfied with the translations, you can go to the Translation tab and then quickly confirm each one of the entries into our local translation memory. As you click each time on Confirm, it'll jump you to the next thing that it has a question about. This is as far as I'll go with this document in this example. But if I were fully done and ready to go, just need to go over to Documents and Export. And I'm ready to import my XLIFF file back into my skeleton file in FrameMaker. We're starting to loop into some of the more technical stuff, so bear with me, but we're going to go back and take a look at the pre-segmented XLIFF options. To do that, we're going to go into the XLIFF dialog box and save off a file that we can edit outside of FrameMaker. So just for clarity, I'm going to get rid of these two paragraphs. And by going up to File, Translation, Export to XLIFF one more time, you see that I've got my Apply XLIFF Segmentation Rules selected. And then I'm currently using my Spaceship XTS file. I'm going to go ahead and save settings. And in that same directory with Spaceship, give it a unique label. That process gives me the file that I need to edit. So I'll go ahead and hit cancel. Like lots of resource files used by FrameMaker and other applications, this XTS file is actually a renamed zip file or a compression file. And if I take the time to decompress it, I can get into those files, I can edit them, and then recompress them for use in FrameMaker. To get access to the file extension, I'll come to the View menu item and select this checkbox. If you don't do that first, you'll probably have trouble renaming it without some sort of utility. Change XTS to ZIP. And recognize that this dialog box needs to be selected. Presegmented.zip now has the zipper icon for my zip file, along with an extract option up here. I can choose Extract All. I'll put it into the same location. And if I back out, you can see that I've got both my pre-segmented zip file and my pre-segmented decompressed file. Go into pre-segmented. And now I have access to all the files contained in here. If you've gotten this far in the process, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what you need to do. You may have gotten instructions from your localization vendor, or you might have done a couple web searches and have a little experience writing regular expressions. If, for example, we were to go into the SRX file, you can see that there are a lot of language files here. And ENUS is our base language. So if I edit this file with Notepad++, I've now opened up my XML file that manages my pre-segmentation. I've got an entire series of rules that prevent breaks around things, among other things, for military titles. So I've got colonel, general, government, honorary, etc. So basically prefixes for names. You can add or omit information from these rules as you see fit. In this case, I don't need to make a change. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to add a space and then delete it. And that gives me a file that I can save basically as a modified file. So I've made a change and now I've saved it. Now I need to back out of that process of decompressing these files. I'm going to go back into my pre-segmented folder. And at this point, I need to recompress the files. This is where you want to be very careful. While it's tempting to simply come up here and compress this pre-segmented file, what that will do is wrap the pre-segmented file in its own zip file. That's not exactly what we want to do. So instead, we want to go into the pre-segmented folder, select the contents of that folder, and then compress those files. There's an easy way to do that inside of Windows. And I'll give this a unique name. I'll call it PreSegmented 2. Just for good measure, I'll take this and put it out with my other file. And my PreSegmented 2 zip file sits right here. I'm already viewing my extensions, so now I can rename this either by right-clicking or simply clicking slowly twice. Changing this extension back to XTS. Getting past the dialog. Now I've got that same icon right there. And if I've done everything correctly, I can now use PreSegmented 2 XTS to produce my pre-segmented XLIFF files in the way that I need. Back in FrameMaker, File, Translation, Export to XLIFF. The XTS file still is spaceship.xts. Now I'll grab my pre-segmented 2 file and hit export. And it looks like we're in good shape. No errors, no warnings, and this information row has 73, just like it did when we did our previous XLIFF export. As you can see, there's a lot of material that goes into the preparation of these XLIFF files for translation. It's not surprising that it gets a little bit technical. We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar annual market. Recall that at the beginning of the session, I mentioned that your localization vendor is thrilled to have you do these things that will reduce your overall bill with them, because these things are much more profitable. When you can process only a small percentage of the same words in an XLIFF file than you would have to in something like a MIF file, then it becomes much more profitable per word, and they can take on more work and thus make more money. So let's compare the size of our general description FrameMaker file as a FrameMaker file as a MIF file, and then as the XLIFF file that we might send out. We've already got the general description.fm file, and if I do a save as, to create a MIF of that same file, I'll save it into that same English directory. I'll also save general description as an XLIFF 1.2. Now let's compare file sizes. In my English directory, my general description file is very small, probably because most of the graphics in here are imported by reference. The MIF file of the same information is 475K. The general description zip file is 124K. But if I extract that file, and then dig into the folder itself, the XLIFF file is less than half the size of the MIF file. And even more important than that, the organization of the XLIFF file lends itself to segmented localization of the content, where the MIF file itself is many, many lines of very confusing information that have to be gone over in order to get to the content that needs localization. Add to that the information for headers, footers, and master pages that simply don't need to be localized for every document, and aside from the character count itself, the labor needed to localize that content is significantly lower, especially when you can add in the higher level of reuse available with an XLIFF file. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you got a lot out of it. I certainly did enjoy putting it together for you. If you need more information about FrameMaker, structured or unstructured, I have reference books, structured authoring workbooks. I've got FrameMaker training, both online and a live upcoming 2-day DITA class. And I've also got options for online meeting, both free consults and quick fixes that you might need to get done. For details on all of that, visit learn.techcomtools.com. For those attending the live version of this information, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer any questions that you've got. If you're watching a recording of this presentation, please do make a comment down below. I'll try and check it and get back to you as soon as I can. And finally, here's some of the best ways to get in touch with me. Thanks for watching.